The Mad Trapper. One man against the Arctic. I have seen wars, famines, and disasters in my 100 years on this earth. I have watched things happen that I would not have believed possible if someone had described them to me before I saw them. I have stood at the edges of events that reshaped the world and felt the particular helplessness of a witness, someone present for something enormous, unable to change it, only able to watch and remember, and eventually tell. But I have never seen a man like Albert Johnson, not a better man, not a worse man, not a man I admired or condemned or fully understood, a man who existed so completely outside the categories I used to make sense of human beings that 100 years later, sitting in this chair, I still reach for him and find that my understanding comes up empty. We never learned his real name. We never learned where he came from or what he had done before he appeared at the edge of the known world in the summer of 1931. We learned only what he did, and what he did was enough to make experienced men, hard men, men who had spent their entire lives in the frozen wilderness of the Canadian North and who were afraid of very little that nature could produce, look at each other across a campfire in 40 below cold and say quietly that they had never encountered anything like this. My name is Elias Whitmore. I am 100 years old. Tonight I am going to tell you about Albert Johnson, and I am going to tell you everything I know. And at the end I am going to tell you what I don't know, which is most of it. You need to understand the place before you can understand what happened there. Not because the place explains the man, nothing explains the man, but because without the place you cannot feel the scale of what occurred. The Northwest Territories of Canada, the Mackenzie Delta, an enormous labyrinthine network of frozen rivers and islands and forest that sprawls across thousands of square miles of subarctic wilderness before it reaches the Beaufort Sea. A place of extraordinary beauty in the way that places untouched by human civilization are beautiful, vast, indifferent, operating according to rules that do not include human comfort among their considerations. In winter, which is what matters for this story, the delta becomes something that has to be experienced to be believed. The temperature drops to 50 below zero Fahrenheit, sometimes colder. At those temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes, not eventually, not after a while, in minutes. The rivers freeze solid. The landscape simplifies into white that extends in every direction to a horizon that in January barely sees the sun. A few hours of grey light, and then darkness again. Wind that has been crossing empty, frozen tundra for 1,000 miles and has built up a cold and a force that has nothing personal in it, but feels personal anyway. People live there. The Gwich'in and other indigenous peoples whose relationship with that landscape goes back thousands of years, and in the 1930s, a scattering of white trappers and traders and Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers whose job was to maintain the thin presence of law and order in a place that law had reached only recently, and not entirely. Albert Johnson walked into that world in the summer of 1931. He appeared in Fort McPherson without anyone being able to say with certainty where he had come from. He was there one day in the way that things in a dream are simply there, without arrival, without origin story, present. A man of perhaps 35 to 45 years, stocky, carrying a rifle and a pack, with eyes that people noticed and then looked away from without being able to entirely say why. He bought supplies, he paid in cash, he said almost nothing. The people who observed him in those weeks remembered him afterward with the particular quality of memory that attaches to things we should have paid more attention to at the time. Sharp in outline, thin in detail. A quiet man, a still man. A man who had apparently decided that the ordinary exchanges of human sociability were not something he was going to engage in. He bought a small boat, he went up the Rat River into the delta, and he started building a cabin. Far from anyone else, far from the nearest other person in a land that was already among the least populated on Earth. He chose a bend of the river that was accessible by water in summer and frozen river in winter, and he built his cabin there, alone. And he intended, it is clear in retrospect that he intended this, absolutely, to be left alone. He built it well, better than you needed to build a cabin for simple shelter. The walls were thick, the construction was careful and deliberate. People who examined the cabin later noted that it had been built in ways that went beyond the requirements of warmth, ways that suggested the builder had been thinking about more than the cold. But that came later. In the summer of 1931, he was just a man who had arrived and wanted to disappear. The North had seen such men. It attracted them. Men with reasons to be far from the places where questions got asked, or simply men who preferred silence. The understanding in those territories was that you left such men alone and they left you alone, and the North was large enough for everyone. It might have stayed that way. Albert Johnson might have lived out his days in that cabin and died there and been remembered by no one, and I would have nothing to tell you. But the trap lines interfered. The conflict that ignited everything was not dramatic, a complaint. The indigenous trappers who had used the land around the Rat River for generations found that someone was interfering with their trap lines, the routes they travelled, and the traps they maintained. They complained to the RCMP. The RCMP did what the RCMP did. They sent an officer to have a conversation. Constable Alfred King, December 26, 1931. Boxing Day. He arrived at the cabin and knocked on the door and explained who he was and why he was there. No response. Smoke from the chimney. The cabin was occupied. He could feel, with the particular awareness of a man doing this kind of work, that he was being watched through the gaps in those thick walls. He knocked again. He waited. He spoke in the reasonable, patient way of a man who has dealt with difficult people in remote places and understands that patience is usually the right approach. The door did not open. King went back to his detachment. He reported the situation. He obtained a warrant. He returned on December 31st with a second constable, New Year's Eve, and knocked again and presented his legal authority and waited. The door did not open. He moved toward the cabin to try the door, and Albert Johnson shot him through it. The bullet hit King in the chest. His heavy winter clothing and the angle of the wound combined to save his life. Barely. But he was badly hurt, and getting badly hurt in the Arctic in December is its own crisis. His partner got him out. They made it back to Fort McPherson. King survived. In the cabin on the Rat River, Albert Johnson waited. He had just shot a police officer. He knew what was coming. He waited anyway. Inspector Alexander Eames assembled a posse. 9 men, Mounties and volunteers, equipped for extended operations in the Arctic winter and dispatched to the Rat River with the intention of bringing Albert Johnson in. They arrived on January 9th, 1932. They surrounded the cabin. They called for Johnson to come out. He fired. They returned fire. And what followed over the next 15 hours was something that each of those experienced men would describe afterward with the same underlying note of disbelief. 1 man against 9 in a cabin in the Arctic dark, and the 9 men could not take him. They tried direct approach and were driven back. They tried angles. They tried covering fire. Johnson's shooting was accurate and controlled. Not the frantic fire of a frightened man, but the measured, economical fire of someone who was managing his ammunition and his positions with cold, deliberate calculation. After 15 hours, they brought out the dynamite, placed it against the cabin wall, and detonated it. The cabin absorbed the explosion. Johnson had built those walls to take something, and they took it, and in the smoke and the debris when the posse rushed the position, Johnson was still fighting, still accurate, still controlled, still completely himself in the immediate aftermath of a dynamite blast that should have ended him. The posse pulled back. They had nothing to show for 15 hours in 40 below cold except a wounded man and an expended supply of explosives. They returned to Fort McPherson. Albert Johnson stayed in his cabin. The second attempt was larger, more men, more dynamite, more determination. They went back on January 16th. They surrounded the cabin again. They called for surrender. Johnson fired. The firefight continued. And then they used the dynamite again, more of it this time, with the intention of finishing what the first explosion had started. The second blast was significant. It damaged the cabin, and in the debris and chaos and churned snow, Albert Johnson came out of the cabin, not surrendering, moving out of the wreckage and into the tree line, pack on his back, rifle in hand, before the posse had fully processed what was happening. He was gone, into the Arctic wilderness. In January, at temperatures that would kill an unprepared person in hours, he ran. What followed over the next 48 days is the part of this story that I have returned to most often in the decades since, the part that I keep examining from different angles, trying to find the place where it makes conventional sense, where a normal understanding of human capability accounts for what occurred. I have not found that place. Albert Johnson, on foot, with whatever he had been able to grab from a partially destroyed cabin, began moving through the Northwest Territories in the depths of Arctic winter. The men pursuing him had dog teams, trained sled dogs, animals bred for exactly this environment, capable of sustained movement in conditions that break most things. The men themselves were experienced Arctic travelers, men who had spent careers in this landscape and knew its demands and knew how to manage those demands. They could not catch him. He moved at speeds that should not have been achievable by a man on foot in those conditions. He covered ground in a day that the pursuing teams with their dogs struggled to match. He crossed terrain that the experienced guides in the posse looked at and assessed as impassable, and then followed his tracks through it because there was no other explanation. He moved at night, which reduced visibility and therefore reduced the advantage of the pursuers who knew the terrain better than he did. He doubled back on his own trail, walking backwards for stretches, stepping in his own footprints in reverse, creating confusion for the dogs that were following his scent. He used the hard, wind-polished surfaces of frozen streams where the cold had made tracking difficult. He was, in other words, not simply running, he was thinking, he was planning, he was managing the pursuit with the deliberate strategy of someone who had considered this scenario and prepared for it, at 50 below zero, while moving fast enough to stay ahead of dog teams. The mind slows in extreme cold. This is not metaphor, but physiology. The brain does not operate at full efficiency when the body is consuming its resources to maintain core temperature. Decision-making degrades, problem-solving degrades. The simple fact of survival imposes costs on the cognitive systems that would otherwise be available for strategy. Albert Johnson appeared to be exempt from this, or had trained himself to function within it, or had some quality of focus that the cold could not reach in the way it reached other men. Constable Edgar Millen, a well-regarded, experienced officer, a man who was liked by everyone who knew him, was killed during one of the engagements. Johnson shot him from a defensive position with accuracy that told every man who witnessed it or heard about it the same thing. This was not luck. This was skill. The kind of skill that is learned in specific circumstances over time under conditions that produce a certain kind of person. What circumstances, what conditions, what kind of person? Nobody could say. Nobody can say. The pursuit became news across Canada and into the United States. Radio audiences followed it through dispatches that came out of the north with the particular quality of things happening in real time in places most people could barely imagine. Albert Johnson, the mad trapper of Rat River, the name the press gave him because it was the name that fit the dramatic shape of the story, became a figure that people who had never been within 1,000 miles of the Northwest Territories found themselves caring about in ways they could not entirely explain. I think I understand why. There is something in the image of one man against all of them that reaches a place in the human imagination that other images don't reach. Not admiration exactly, not sympathy, because the man had killed and wounded people whose deaths and wounds mattered. Something more complicated, the recognition of something extreme, of a human capability pushed to a limit that most people never see and cannot imagine, producing a response that is beyond the ordinary categories of approval and disapproval. He was doing something that could not be done, and he kept doing it. Inspector Eames made the decision to bring in an airplane, not a small decision in 1932 in the Arctic North. Aircraft in those conditions were still relatively new tools and relatively dangerous ones, subject to the same cold and mechanical challenge that everything else in that environment faced. But conventional pursuit was not going to work, and Eames knew it, and a man was dead, and others were at risk, and something different was required. Wat May flew in, Wilfrid Reed May, a First World War flying ace, a legend of Canadian bush aviation, a man whose skills in the air were as extraordinary as Johnson's skills on the ground. He could search from above, he could spot Johnson's trail from an altitude that made the white landscape readable in ways it was not from within it. He could relay Johnson's position to the ground teams and allow coordination that one man on foot had not been able to counter. The dynamics of the pursuit changed, not immediately, not completely, but the airplane reduced Johnson's ability to disappear in the ways he had been disappearing. The terrain that had swallowed his trail from the ground was more readable from above. They cornered him on the Eagle River. February 17th, 1932. He had been running for 48 days. He had covered approximately 250 miles. He had crossed the Richardson Mountains in winter, a fact that the experienced men who heard it received with a particular silence, because crossing the Richardson Mountains in winter was not something that people did, was not something that the accumulated practical knowledge of Arctic travel included as an option for a man on foot. He had been shot. The accounts indicate wounds from multiple engagements during the pursuit. Wounds that had not stopped him. They converged on the Eagle River with the ground teams and the airplane and the coordination that the airplane had made possible. They tightened the cordon. The run was ending. Albert Johnson turned and fought. I have thought about this moment more times than I can count. The end was clear. He was surrounded. He was one man, wounded, on a frozen river, with the RCMP closing from multiple directions and an airplane communicating his position from above. The rational calculation was surrender. The survival calculation was surrender. He turned and fought. He exchanged fire with the posse on the ice of the Eagle River. He was hit. He fought on. He was hit again. He fought on. He died on the ice. February 17th, 1932, with his rifle in his hands, still shooting until he couldn't anymore. And then the investigation, the thing that was supposed to answer the question, the fingerprints, the photographs, the physical evidence, the comparison against records across Canada and the United States, and eventually further, Europe, South America, wherever there were records to compare against. Nothing. His fingerprints matched no criminal record anywhere. His description matched no wanted poster. The name Albert Johnson, which was almost certainly not his real name, simply the name he had offered, when he bought supplies in Fort McPherson, appeared in no relevant database attached to any person who could be connected to the man on that frozen river. He had no identification, no papers, no letters, no photographs, no objects that connected him to a name or a family or a place. Nothing in his pack and nothing in his cabin and nothing on his person that said who he was. He had been, in the documentary sense, Albert Johnson for less than a year. And before that, nothing, a blank, a man who had stepped out of no record and into Fort McPherson, and then out of the world entirely on the Eagle River, leaving behind only questions. The theories came, they always do. Some said criminal, a man who had done something serious, something that made identification worse than death, that made resistance to any engagement with law enforcement a matter of absolute priority regardless of the consequences. The completeness of his disappearance from all records and the ferocity of his resistance to any attempt to identify him suggested, to people who thought about it carefully, a man for whom being known was the most dangerous possible outcome. Some said military. The skills were too specific and too complete to have been acquired casually. The marksmanship, accurate in extreme cold against moving targets under pressure. The survival competence that exceeded the practical experience of men who had spent their entire professional lives in that environment. The tactical thinking, the doubling back, the terrain selection, the defensive positions, that did not look like improvisation, but like the application of trained knowledge. Somewhere in Albert Johnson's past was instruction, specific professional instruction in exactly the things he turned out to need. Some said Scandinavian. Isotopic analysis of his remains conducted decades later with techniques unavailable in 1932 suggested he had grown up in a northern climate, possibly Norway or Sweden or Finland. A man formed in a Scandinavian winter would have a relationship with cold that was different from men formed elsewhere. The cold that was killing the pursuit might have been, for him, something closer to home. None of these theories closed the mystery. They narrowed it. They placed it in a general territory without arriving at a specific address. In 2007, DNA was extracted from his remains. The profile exists. It waits. The right comparison has not yet been found. He is still technically a John Doe, an unidentified person, a man without a confirmed name. What do I take from Albert Johnson after all these years? Not a hero, not a villain. I have resisted both framings for a century, and I resist them still, because both require fitting him into a category that he occupied only partially, and that he would have, I suspect, refused entirely. What I take is a question, the question underneath all the drama and the cold and the shooting on the frozen river. What does it take to want to be unknown that completely? To walk away from the world of names and records and documented existence so thoroughly that when you die there is nothing left but a body and a mystery? To choose, if it was choice, a life in which your identity was your most closely guarded possession, guarded more carefully than your safety, guarded at the cost of everything. Some people do this from shame, from something in their past that the world would condemn if it knew. Some people do it from fear, from something coming for them that they are trying to stay ahead of. And some people, and I have come to believe Albert Johnson may have been among these, do it from a fundamental refusal, a decision that the self they had been in the world was not a self they intended to carry forward. That beginning again, completely, without the weight of the prior record, was worth any price the world could name. Was he running from something, running towards something, simply running? I don't know. Nobody knows. What I know is that he built a cabin far from everyone and intended to stay there and fought with everything he had. When that intention was challenged, and when fighting was no longer possible, he died still fighting on a frozen river, rather than yield to the thing he had come all this way to escape. whatever that thing was. The North keeps its secrets, it always has. The vast silence of those territories has absorbed more than Albert Johnson. More stories, more lives, more mysteries that walked into the wilderness and did not walk back out in any form that could be read and understood by the people left behind. But Albert Johnson is the one that I cannot stop thinking about, the one that surfaces in the quiet hours, when I am old enough and still enough to let the things I haven't resolved come back to the surface. A man built a cabin on the Rat River in 1931. He built it strong and he built it alone, and he intended to live in it in silence until whatever silence he was seeking had given him what he needed. Instead, he died on a frozen river 48 days after he left it, having covered 250 miles through conditions that should have stopped him and not stopped, having outlasted and outwitted and outfought men who were very good at what they did and who had every advantage that numbers and equipment and local knowledge could provide. He was whoever he was. He is still whoever he was. The name Albert Johnson is not a name but a placeholder, a blank space where a life should be, marking the location of a mystery that every technique and every decade has failed to close. I am 100 years old. I have been carrying this mystery for most of those years. I am no closer to the answer than the men who stood over him on the Eagle River ice and looked at his face and realized they had no idea who they were looking at. Some mysteries don't resolve, they only deepen and become more fully themselves and leave you, if you have spent long enough with them, not with answers, but with the weight of the question, which is its own kind of knowledge. Albert Johnson, the mad trapper of Rat River, unknown in life, unknown in death, unknown still, whoever he was real. And for 48 days in the Arctic winter of 1932, he was the most extraordinary thing those frozen territories had ever seen. My name is Elias Whitmore. I am 100 years old, and I am still, after all this time, unable to stop listening for the answer. It is out there somewhere, in the cold, in the silence, waiting.